even be something that you paid attention to, but for people who are studying Turkey, they were very key. Let me introduce Cihan Tugal, and also, of course, I should thank our co-sponsors. The Turkey Studies Research Cluster is sponsored by the Davis Humanities Institute. And then for events, we look for co-sponsorships. For this one, we were lucky to have Middle East South Asia Studies Program, History Department, Religious Studies Department, and the Program in Critical Theory to co-sponsor us. So I would like to thank them all. Cihan Tugal is an Associate Professor of Sociology at Berkeley, University of California in Berkeley. He is the author of Passive Revolution, Absorbing the Islamic Challenge to Capitalism, which was published by Stanford University Press in 2009. Let me read to you just a few book reviews about his book. Salwa Ismail from University of London in American Journal of Sociology wrote, Cihan Tugal's Passive Revolution provides a rich and detailed account of the transformations of the Islamist movement in Turkey over the last 3 decades. It presents a sophisticated and original conceptual framework that guides the analysis of these transformations. Passive Revolution is an excellent contribution to the study of counter-hegemonic projects and the alternative paths they follow. It brings the study of radicalization and de-radicalization of Islamist activism into the broader field of political sociology and demonstrates the unique contributions that critical ethnographic methods make to the study of politics. Tugal also studies Islamic mobilization in Egypt and Iran in order to understand why similar movements have not resulted in a comparable Islamic market consensus in these countries. He argues that Islamic politics had interacted with civil society and the state in different ways in these 3 cases, leading to the victory of neoliberalized Islam in Turkey, its defeat in Iran, and a stalemate in Egypt. The revolutionary situation in Egypt presents new possibilities for neoliberal Islam, as well as new impediments to its popularization, as pointed out in his recent article in Development and Change. His work is based on ethnographic studies. For that, he lived for a long time in a poor and conservative district in Istanbul for his book. And we were just talking about his next project, and he was telling me that he, again, needs to work someplace where he can stay for a long time, and that gives some limitations sometimes. So, without further ado, let's listen to Professor Tugal, and his title for today is The Aporias of Urban Protests in Istanbul, How Middle-Class Revolt Undermines Itself. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much. Okay, thanks for that generous introduction, and thanks for insisting that I come, because with 2 kids sometimes things are really difficult to organize, and somebody has to push me for these talks to happen. Okay, so for 10-15 years I have focused on Islamic politics, but this new scene in Turkey has luckily forced me to look at other actors as well. And I have been studying the urban face of Islamic transformation in Turkey, so I was not a stranger to the topic of urban protest and its limits in Turkey, as they had been directed against this Islamic and neoliberal transformation of the urban landscape. And when the protests over this past summer erupted, I was honestly surprised. So I wasn't expecting them, and nobody was expecting them. But I was more surprised by the heavy middle class participation and even leadership in these revolts, because apparently, at least, the most severely hit people were not the professional and new middle classes who have put their cultural and political stamp on these revolts. And I start with this concept borrowed from Greek philosophy and updated by French philosophy, aporia, to emphasize, just like a text that undermines itself at certain points in the text. The middle class, or the heavily middle class revolt in Istanbul over the summer had many points, just like a text. Some sentences in a text might contradict the whole spirit of the text. We could say the same thing for these protests in Istanbul, and I'll try to highlight some of these moments of internal self-contradiction, but I will try to draw some theoretical and political lessons from them, rather than just engage in the pleasure of the text and just derive some joy from criticizing how the text undermines itself. Here is one example. So, as you might know, I don't know how many of you followed these protests actually, but the initial trigger of the protest was the construction of a mall right in the center of Taksim, which is Istanbul's main entertainment square. And basically the revolt used a quasi-environmentalist and quasi-urban rights language to protest the construction of the mall, and then it spread to other neighborhoods and cities. And this is one of the other spots in Istanbul where the revolt spread. This is Levent, and in a moment I will show it on the map. The aporia here is that this is an upscale mall, not just a mall, but one of the most upscale malls in Istanbul. And during the lunch hour, these quite well-to-do new middle-class professionals, leave their workplaces around this mall and come to the mall to protest the construction of another mall in another part of the city. So what does that mean? I mean, are they just contradicting themselves, or do they have a different agenda? What's going on? Well, okay. So this is Beyoğlu, İstiklal, Taksim. This is the heart of the revolt, and this is where the construction of the mall was planned. As you can see, this is the heaviest protest center in all of Istanbul. And based on mostly eyewitness reports rather than solid empirical research, we can say that this corridor from Taksim to Levent, which includes Şişli, Mecidiyeköy, that corridor is heavily populated by middle-class workers. So people who work in real estate, finance, and these other new sectors which are a part of Turkey's booming neoliberal economy. And they became the leaders of this revolt, even though the revolt spread to these other less fortunate neighborhoods in Istanbul. And the places other than Beyoğlu, Şişli, Mecidiyeköy, Taksim, Levent, I want to highlight is Beşiktaş and Kadıköy, which are two other middle class, upper middle class districts, and they also heavily participated not only in the initial revolt, but after June 16 in the organization of the post-revolt institutions. And then the other places, mostly around Ümraniye, Sarıgazi, and then Gazi Osman Pasha, and more mixed places like Maltepe and Kartal, where you find a heavy working class and or sub-proletarian presence, and with exceptions in Maltepe and Kartal, when you look at Ümraniye and Gazi Osman Pasha, these protests were heavily dominated by a sectarian minority specific to Turkey known as the Alevis, which should be distinguished from the Alawites in Syria, and we can talk more about that if you're interested later on. So what was happening, and why this heavy concentration here? Why the participation in these spaces? And what brings them together, and what keeps them apart? I want to talk about that mainly. So when you look at the mainstream journalistic and academic analysis of the revolt, what was most emphasized, especially in the liberal and libertarian left press and academy, was the özgürlükçü or libertarian spirit of the revolt against increasing authoritarianism. And this mainstream framing tried to downplay the urban aspects of the revolt, and it cannot really answer why there would be this response to authoritarianism in 2013, given that Turkey was an authoritarian state and society throughout its history. And there were much more intensely authoritarian eras. And I would like to highlight 1993 to 1995, the nightmare political years in Turkey. Millions forced to leave their villages, thousands of people killed, and right in the middle of Istanbul, again in Gazi Osman Pasha, one of the Alevi neighborhoods, dozens killed overnight, and everybody's watching this. Nobody's reacting, basically, except like a 3,000 strong demonstration, or 3,000 weak demonstration held in Kadıköy that I will come to. And then when you look at the 2000s, it's not that dramatic, but still thousands of journalists and activists from the Kurdish party were imprisoned and otherwise harassed. So no response to that, no mass response to that. Then why mass response to the harassment of the activists in this park in the heart of Istanbul? So when a research institution called Konda asked on its survey to people in the park itself why they decided to join the protests, around 50% of them did say it was a reaction to police violence, so strengthening this libertarianism framework. But if you look at the urban aspects of this, the attempts to cut trees in the park, and then the Taksim project, so this transformation of the Gezi Park in Taksim into a mall, that also adds up to 30%. Okay? And that's a serious part of this. But how do we bring these together? I mean, are these separate concerns? My argument is that there is really a contingent articulation happening here, involving concerns with a growing police state and urban development, but especially to the extent that they hurt the middle classes. Because huge numbers react to the authoritarianism when it targets the trees, so not the Kurds, not the Alevis, not the poor, not the subproletariat, not the peasants, but the trees and the middle class activists, quite respectable activists with MAs or PhDs or on their way to PhDs and MAs. Okay, so what exactly are the issues, though? Why are those activists there, and why can this act as such a strong trigger? And what do I mean when I say strong? Well, again, going back to this map, so what's happened right around this area, not on June 15 and June 16, but on June 3rd, was that 900,000 people gathered right in this area. They surrounded Taksim Square, and they tried to force their way in, and they ultimately did. And 900,000 is a big number in Turkish politics. It might not be a big number in European politics or Latin American politics, but 900,000 is a serious number in Turkey, because this really legendary demonstration that happened in 1977 in Taksim Square again boasted around 500,000 people, and it became a legend. I mean, that's such a big number, even though the city today is 12 million. Back then it was around 4 million, and it was really activists from all around Turkey that came to populate the square in 1977. So that's why it was so huge. But huge is just 500,000. Now this is just the residents of the city on June 3rd. And it's still 900,000. So that legendary mark has been surpassed. So why does this happen? Well, I really have to build up to this. First, we need to take the Gezi Park in Taksim seriously as an urban site. Now, this is the last green area in the middle of Taksim, which is the main entertainment square or the main cultural, I should say, broader than entertainment, cultural entertainment square or area in Istanbul, but also in Turkey. So it was also an old Armenian cemetery. So in the 19th century, it was an Armenian cemetery. Then the Ottomans confiscated it and turned it into a military barracks. And then in the early Republican era, the area usually became residential. And the government's project was to build not just any shopping mall, but a shopping mall that had the architecture of military barracks. And this also really condenses the whole vision of the AKP government in Turkey. It's not just, market capitalism and profits, but it's also a quite war-prone, a quite militaristic capitalism, as much as it is a market-oriented capitalism. And of course, you can always have the two go together, as you can see in the figure of Dick Cheney. So what was happening in early 2013 also fed into the significance of the park. So there was ongoing urban transformation-related mobilization around the Taksim Square in the first months of 2013. First, the government took over one of the allegedly, presumably, one of the best cafes in Beyoğlu, which is very near, which is close to Taksim, which is Inci Cafe, and they, what they did was they, okay, two main details. I'll skip this, but similarly, the government takes over a historical movie theater, and these are two historical sites which are frequented by the cultural elite in Turkey. And so there was a lot of mobilization to preserve these sites based on the argument that they were historical and had cultural value. But the thing we have to understand is that these takeovers, these aggressive urban transformation projects, did not just target Taksim and the surrounding area. So they targeted Taksim and the surrounding area in 2013 or close to 2013. But for a whole decade, the government was actually transforming all of Turkey along these lines. So green areas, parks, historical sites, and squatter residences were being bulldozed to open up space for luxurious residences, but also government housing projects for lower middle and middle class residents, and also shopping malls. Many shopping malls throughout Turkey, but especially in Istanbul. And all of these projects brought Turkey to the brink of urban ecological disaster, and we are still heading in that direction. So right after Gezi, there was this optimism that the revolt, the Gezi revolt, would eventually put an end to this. But no, actually the government is very much decided to do all of this. And there is, for example, the project of building a third bridge across the Bosphorus. And why is this, why am I calling this an ecological disaster? Is that hyperbole? Well, they're cutting millions of trees to do this. And it is estimated that this will add perhaps 2 million or so cars to Istanbul's traffic, which is already clogged. But more disastrously, the government has the plan to build a second strait, an artificial one, that will cut through Istanbul, that will connect the Black Sea and the Marmara Sea. And in order to do that, they can't just cut down 2 million trees. They have to vacate around 2 to 3 million people from their neighborhoods and homes. Okay, so this is not going to be just ecological disaster, but urban ecological disaster. And there's also a similar project which is very contentious of building a third major airport that will compete with the Frankfurt airport. So, and there are many parallels in rural Turkey, but I won't go into these. What is most significant for me, and what I had studied over a decade, was why there is no significant resistance to all of these projects. Okay? So there was all of this environmental activism. So environmentalists were shouting out at the top of their lungs, you know, we are going to, you know, a horrible situation. Nobody cared. Then there were these small resistances throughout the neighborhoods of Istanbul, but nobody cared. Nobody connected them. Of course, there were activist attempts to connect them, but nationally not visible, and not visible at the city level either. So why is that? Well, what I have been studying is really the establishment of consent around neoliberalism in Turkey. And in my book, I studied more the cultural, religious, and political aspects of that. And after the book was published, or maybe a little before that, I started to focus more on the material aspects of consent. And I found out that the material aspects of consent to the government's neoliberalism was mostly concentrated in urban issues. So the government would just walk into these squatter residences, demolish them, but basically buy all as a part of the homeowners, especially those from the dominant ethnic and sectarian groups. But I mean, it wasn't doing this necessarily based only on sectarian and ethnic fault lines. Whoever was better connected and had the potential to mobilize other people, they would just buy them and you know, give them better deals. So they were more generously compensated than other people. And tenants, unlike the homeowners, were more easily pushed out. But it wasn't just that. I mean, their vision actually promised something to people. What did it promise? Well, you know, these squatter residences are no heaven, you know. I mean, they even though they might have electricity and water and sewage, so it's not like, you know, exactly like the favelas of Brazil. It's much better in Turkey. But still, I mean, their heating is based on rural stoves. And the promise is when they move to the housing projects, then they will have natural gas. And there are these and other similar promises of modernization. And the shopping malls were really distasteful for the cultural elite in Istanbul, but not so much for the squatters. The shopping malls actually gave them chances to socialize. Okay. And there is some ethnographic research into this. Unfortunately, very, very little. But some sociologists and anthropologists have shown that actually some of these people who were quite willing to move to the housing projects because of this vision suffered in the long run. Okay? They eventually got pushed out of their apartments in the housing projects too, due to the bills and the living costs and the social environment. But how much can we generalize this? I don't know. I mean, this is mostly ethnographic research, and only in a few neighborhoods of Istanbul. So when none of these worked, the government also applied strategies of divide and rule. So here is where it became more explicitly sectarian and ethnic. So it won the Turkish Sunnis much more easily to its side in these urban transformation projects. And when none of this worked, then of course repression was resorted to. But consent building was taken much more seriously and pushed to its limits before this resort to repression. So only 2 neighborhoods could sustain resistance to the demolishment of their residences throughout these 10 years. Only 2. And we're really talking about, you know, several thousand people in a city of 12 million. So just a very quick theoretical note here, and I can open this up if you want later. There is a growing literature on accumulation by dispossession, influenced by David Harvey. And David Harvey, of course, became a bigger name in Turkey after the Gezi Revolt because of his emphasis on urban rights. But the issue is, you know, in the euphoria of the June days of the Gezi Revolt, people thought, oh, now, you know, we're going to have urban rights. We're going to have this huge movement. And this is, you know, this crazy government neoliberalization is going to stop or at least slow down. Well, in that euphoria, what they were missing was this complex picture of accumulation by dispossession. Even when people are dispossessed, it doesn't happen in, you know, a sweeping way. I mean, it is targeted, it is localized, and it is flexible. And this is what much of the literature misses. And it is not just, you know, targeted and flexible, but the government is actually pouring a lot of money into this. So these housing projects are serious. Okay? And we don't know a lot about the exact numbers, but it seems that a serious part of the government spending is going into urban housing projects for the poor and for the lower middle and middle classes. So there is this, you know, very interesting mixture between neoliberalism and some urbanized version of crazy government spending. So these are the, this is one of the neighborhoods, actually the toughest neighborhood in Istanbul. This is Maltepe, and Başıbüyük is to the north, should be northeast of Maltepe. And it was the only neighborhood that could really uphold its resistance throughout the 10 years. And actually, they became so experienced and trained, and I'm talking about the local ordinary residents of this neighborhood. We actually saw many of them in Gezi Park. I mean, they were, as a neighborhood, they were bussed there during the Gezi Revolt. So they became a part of the revolt. And the reason I'm saying this is because even though the revolt seemed to be concentrated right here, it was drawing all of these people from throughout Istanbul when it was in its heyday, which is the first 2 weeks of June. So, despite this multi-class picture, what I want to emphasize is the heavy participation by professionals and the middle-class-based social movements and social movement organizations, rather than the unions. So the unions were symbolically there. They were there in name, but they could not really mobilize their base. So the people who heavily populated the park belonged to the professional associations of Istanbul. So the architects, engineers, doctors, lawyers, these became the face of the movement and the troops on the ground, at least in Gezi Park itself. So the formal urban proletariat was not that much present, but then we see this Alevi participation, mostly sub-proletarian, even though partially working class too, but heavily informal, really, rather than class-based. And when we look at other parts of the city, actually there was a lot of old-style secularist participation. And there were actually huge marches against the AKP in 2007, solely based on reaction to the Islamic policies of the government. And the same people got mobilized again in this protest, but they partially at least tried to blend in with the anti-authoritarian and anti-neoliberal tone of the revolt. And what we see much more than them is this new either post or non-secular, not Islamic but not secular either, identity politics. So I would like to, for example, highlight the LGBT movement, which was getting really much more organized throughout the 2000s in Turkey, but became very visible and started to occupy a central place in the Gezi protests. So when we look at the aftershocks of the movement, so after June 16, there is much more participation also in Hatay, which I will show on the map, and Tuzluçayır. And these are, again, two Alevi neighborhoods. Actually, in Hatay, we see a mixture of what I differentiated as Alevi and Syrian Alawite. And that the Hatay population is not perhaps exactly Alawite, but it's not very much along the lines of Turkish or Kurdish Alevis either in their theology and culture. It's a mixture between the two. And in these two places, the resistance became heavily anti-sectarian, so reacting to the Sunni aspects of the governing regime, and also its attempts to wage war on Syria. One of the most significant aspects of the revolt was that the non-Alevi Kurds, so there are both Alevis and Sunni Muslims among the Kurdish population, the non-Alevi Kurds stayed out of the revolt, not in terms of their base, so the base actually participated, but the organizations withheld formal participation. So you could actually see people on the ground carrying the flags of the Kurdish organizations, but the head of the Kurdish organizations either kept their distance to the revolt or actually condemned the revolt. So this is Tuzluçayır. So this is Ankara, okay, and this is Mamak, right in the center of Ankara, and Tuzluçayır is one of the neighborhoods in Ankara. The reason why there was a lot of participation in this particular neighborhood was because one of the allies of the regime, or one of the previous allies of the regime, the Gülen community, was trying to assimilate the population in Tuzluçayır, assimilate them into Sunni Islam. And this is Hatay, right on the border with Syria, and it has really suffered from the conflict between Syria and Turkey, and the population in Hatay was reacting against the warmongering of the government. But still, I mean, even if we take the revolt as a condensation of the urban neoliberal grievances and the Islamic grievances, still why June 2013? So there was warmongering before that, there was neoliberalism before that, there was urban transformation before that, and there was certainly a lot of authoritarianism throughout. So why this specific month? Well, when you look at early 2013, you get some clues, especially around Taksim. The police surveillance of soccer fans increased. And there were many reasons for this, but one reason was the residence of the Prime Minister Tayyip Erdoğan was moved to Dolmabahçe, which is very close to the soccer stadium, and the fans didn't want that. The fans didn't want him there, and the police didn't like that. So there was a lot of harassment throughout 2013, and the sexual control also increased. So Tayyip Erdoğan said, I think just the day before the Gezi protests, that he was quite disturbed by people holding hands around his new neighborhood in Dolmabahçe, Beşiktaş. So, and the harassment of the other usual activists, the left-wing, the LGBT, etc., activists also increased in this time period. And the most significant thing, as I have been trying to emphasize, is that similar harassment, similar targeting was spread throughout Turkey. for decades. But things got really explosive when the home of this cultural elite was threatened. And of course, no sane government, no completely sane government, wants to attack resourceful people without any serious reason. So why did this government do this? And I'm not going to argue that they're insane, but they had their reasons for attacking them and increasing the control throughout Turkey, which includes now the home of the cultural elite. Well, what people have been emphasizing most is the overblown confidence of the regime. And they add, most scholars and journalists also add a lot of psychological explanation to this. Okay, so the prime minister is a megalomaniac, etc., etc. Well, these might be partially true, but I don't think we should push that too far. What is more interesting for me is, well, a couple of things, but all of them condensed really in the AKP's Imperial failure, which became more and more obvious in early 2013. So what do I mean by that? I can't open that much right now. I mean, that would take another talk. But Turkey felt very self-assured after 2011, after the Arab revolts, that it was going to control Arab lands from then on. Okay? Economically, ideologically, politically, perhaps even militarily, if the US allowed that. And by 2013, it became clear that that was not going to happen. And Erdogan's last attempt was a trip to the US in May 2013, which thoroughly demoralized him. And we don't know all the contents of the meeting, but the current public speculation is that he was trying to incite, through many conspiracies, he was trying to incite Obama to make him attack Syria militarily. So that's the conspiracy theory. But there are many other non-conspiratorial signs that he was really pushing hard for a more militaristic solution in Syria throughout these meetings, and he failed. And if we look at the major revolts of the 19th and 20th century, we see that imperial failures quickly lead to increased repression, and that is very likely to incite revolt. But I'm not trying to pose this as the sole explanation. Actually, I'm very much against independent variable type of thinking when it comes to revolt. I rather think that we should really look at the accumulation of contradictions and the condensation of contradictions. Okay? So there was imperial failure, but there was also slowing down of development. There was the Arab revolt, and all of these interacted in very complex ways. And I'm going to return to the Arab revolt when I get to the very end. So I know this is a little cryptic because I can't really go into the Imperial project. But what interests me most here is why these new middle classes were so ready to revolt when they were targeted. And for understanding that, we have to go beyond the immediate conjuncture and again scale upwards and look at Istanbul as a whole. So when we look at the lifestyles of these people and the standing of these people, the people who revolted and put their cultural stamp on the revolt, actually, they are the beneficiaries of neoliberalism, or among the beneficiaries, not the top beneficiary, of course, that's the business class, but they are among the beneficiaries of neoliberalism. So they had, better cars, better homes, higher wages, but they kept complaining because Istanbul became an unlivable city. It became an ugly city with a lot of environmental issues, and even though they were getting richer cash-wise, that didn't mean they necessarily lived a better life because of, again, the transportation and this pending dispossession. So this is still ongoing, actually. This is an unresolved issue. But one of the projects of the government is removing also the middle classes from their apartment buildings throughout Istanbul. So in the 2000s, it was just the squatters. Now they also they want to remove the middle and upper middle class professionals from their apartment buildings, not squatter houses. So this is a much more complicated process, of course, and there are more legal issues because these are legal residences as opposed to the squatter residences. And there has to be more compensation, or at least it would seem, but it also seems that the government is going to give them very little in return. So these all seem to be playing some role in this revolt. So what the uprising provided and what it became such a magnet for 2 weeks was, I argue, this sense of experiencing a new city, less touched by neoliberalism, but as I will highlight, not untouched by neoliberalism. So these classes still hanged on to their neoliberal pleasures. But when I talk to these people in Kadıköy, Beşiktaş, Taksim, these were really frequent sentences, and such sentences have been repeated by other journalistic and academic reports. So why were you there? Because we shared everything. There was no selfishness. We were ready to die for each other. We were ready to risk our health and lives for each other, etc., etc. So this feeling of solidarity, this move away from selfishness, this move away from commodities, and these commodities had determined the lives of these people, not just through the AKP years, not just through the AK Party years, but starting with 1980, which is the beginning point of Turkey's neoliberalization. But this doesn't mean this anti-neoliberalism or semi-anti-neoliberalism necessarily translated into a left-wing or a socialist or a Marxist language. Of course, there was a lot of Marxist discourse going around, especially influenced by David Harvey, who has influenced the urban social movement scene in Istanbul. So still in the post-revolt institutionalization attempts as well, you see a lot of David Harvey language going around. But mixed with other things, especially contempt for the lower classes who still vote for the AKP. And I don't want to create this image that it's only the lower classes who vote for the AKP, because actually, even though they might not like to admit, these financial professionals and real estate professionals who work in this Taksim, Levent, Şişli, Mecidiyeköy area, many of them also voted for the AKP. But it's really hard to crack the code here and understand who did why and when, because even the top journalists today in Turkey who have supported the AKP, voted for the AKP, today deny this, okay? And one wonderful example is Hasan Cemal, who recently wrote, this year I voted for this party, this year I voted for this party, and a whole big list of lies. He was one of the staunch supporters of the AKP. So there's this, self-denial. People were invested in the AKP's project from throughout the social stratification map. So it wasn't just the lower classes, it wasn't just the conservatives. The AKP had very broad appeal. But when you listen to the voice of the revolt, as can be heard through these assemblies. I participated in many of these assemblies in Kadıköy and Beşiktaş. So the people who stood up and spoke at these assemblies, especially those not from Marxist organizations, went into diatribes against the ignorant people who voted for the AKP because they didn't know their interests, because they were stupid, because they were illiterate, etc., etc. And they hopelessly clinged on to this notion that the AKP was just buying their votes by giving them coal and rice and clothing, and in return getting votes. Now, what I want to do here is not just complain about these really shallow analyses, but point out that this mixture of anti-neoliberal, anti-authoritarian revolt and class contempt has much to do with structural determinants. And here, even though I don't want to go into a lot of theoretical debate, I'm basing my claims mostly on the works of class analysts such as Pierre Bourdieu, Eric Olin Wright, and Nikos Poulantzas. So basically, these middle classes are situated in between the bourgeoisie and the working classes. So they have this, social justice and anti-commodification language against the upper classes, but they also have a language, and not only a language, but a practice of distinction in response to the lower classes. And the commodification of the last 30-35 years has really produced a shallow life for this class. But at the same time, it has benefited them. So, as I was saying, more cash, better vacations, better cars. Housing, I'm not sure. Housing, as I was saying, is a mixture. Some of them live in more luxurious homes now, but then the homes of others are under the threat of demolition, right? So things go both ways when it comes to the housing issue. But this upscale mall revolt then, or protest, is not an accident. Okay? It is really related to the structural contradictions, the contradictory location of these class fractions. And that contradictoriness, being below the upper class but above the working class, and therefore having this desire and will to reproduce that domination and distinction, gives rise to a very mixed culture of protest. So in this middle class revolt, there are anti-authoritarian tendencies, yes, but there are also very strongly inegalitarian tendencies. And also, I could get into this more later in the Q&A session, but what I'm trying to argue is that the whole spread of a certain kind of social movement in the last 15 years has to do a lot with the decline of the industrial proletariat and the rise of these classes to the center of social movements. So the whole culture and discourse of autonomy, the popularity of Deleuze and Guattari and all of their students, the people they have influenced like Negri and Agamben. All of this stuff really has to do with the contradictory locations these class fractions occupy in social space, which also translates to the denial of the importance of that social map. So classes don't matter anymore. Social structure doesn't matter anymore. And then more Bourdieusian elements. The whole aestheticization of the revolt. So the whole revolt scene in June was experienced as entertainment. It was really entertaining. I was entertained as well. It was really fun. And this is what Bourdieu signals in Distinction as the fun ethic of the rising new petit bourgeoisie. And of course, this fun ethic, this entertainment, is not devoid of class content, as in Roland Barthes' work, for example. The pleasure of the text is not classless. Because, just let me give an example. So people are clashing with the police. So, right, they're risking their health. And they thought they were risking their lives, but they weren't. But that's another issue. Look, so the deaths happened mostly in Alevi neighborhoods. And all of the martyrs of the revolt are Alevi. So it turns out the professionals were not risking their lives, but back then nobody knew, right? So people thought that they could die at any moment because the police were killing people. But at least they were, objectively speaking, risking their health. Okay, lots of tear gas. Lots of people had lung problems. Lots of people lost their eyes. So real, permanent injury resulted, even for the professionals. But at the same time, so people are clashing with the police. So these clashes went on for hours throughout the night. Okay, so they started at 7 p.m. Why 7 p.m.? Because these financial professionals again leave their work and have their nice dinners, and then put on their jeans, go revolt. But serious risky stuff, right? So 2 hours of clashes, and then beer break. And then they go to the chic bars of Istiklal and Taksim. And I'm not, just complaining about this. I did it myself. Okay. But why is this important? Because some people fit, of course, in those places, and some people don't. And beer was heavily consumed too in the Kadıköy assemblies and Beşiktaş assemblies. And people might not be exactly aware of this, but there's a lot of distinction going on, right? Not just by your clothes and accent and manners, but based on what you consume. I have many caveats about this too, but I'm running out of time. But what I want to emphasize in the last couple of minutes is that this is one reason why this unreflexive middle class revolt led to the re-entrenchment of the parties, the governing parties' hold, especially over the lower classes. Now, the party is running into difficulties elsewhere, especially among its liberal supporters and some of its Islamic supporters. Okay, so there's trouble here in the Gülen community and among the secular as well as Islamic liberals. But after the revolt, actually the Sunni working classes, so the Turkish Sunni, I should say, but yeah, the Kurdish too. So the Sunni working classes became more staunch supporters of the party because they felt that the party was seriously threatened. And of course, there were a lot of conspiracy theories. So who is supporting this revolt? It's not just popular revolt. The argument is it's the Germans, because they don't want an airport competing with the Frankfurt airport. It's the English. That one is very interesting because I first heard this conspiracy theory from a PKK activist. And then I read about it in the Islamic press. So the English don't want this because if there's a strait, a second strait in Istanbul, then huge ships, Russian ships, will pass through the Bosphorus or Istanbul instead of going through the northern seas. So the English don't want the AKP either. So people seriously believe this, not just AKP supporters, but even PKK supporters. So strong Kurdish activists with at least some Marxism in their past. Well, I could go deeply into this, but really just one last minute. So I have to wrap things up. So what's happened as a result was that the party got a strong approval for its iron fist just a few weeks ago. And I'm surprised why nobody was expecting this, but nobody was expecting this. Okay, now I was caught off guard by the Gezi protests too, so nobody's perfect, obviously. But the March victory of the party, the local election victory, was so obvious. It was so obvious that it's unbelievable how the journalists and at least some academics were surprised. But that also has to do with how much they are cut off from the working classes, who are strong supporters, or some working classes, the non-Alevi working classes, the Sunni working classes, who are strong supporters of this party. And so the last point, sorry for going over time a couple of minutes. What I really want to emphasize as an overall theoretical point and political point too, that this new middle class culture of not just the Gezi revolt, but global revolt, Occupy, the Spanish and Greek revolts, some of the North African revolts, some of the Brazilian revolt. This culture, this new culture of protest, reproduces or perhaps increases the distance between the middle classes and middle class activism and the working classes. Unless the working and subproletarian class fractions have some other reason to have sympathy in the middle class revolt, such as in the case of Alevis. Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, please. The floor is open for any questions you might have. Please.
How did the statistics of participants compare to the May Day? Because May Day was huge in that area, right before June. The May Day revolts were quite large and mostly lower middle class, right?
Well, it is true that the May Day has more union participation. And it's also the May Day is also a site where these professional associations heavily participate because they're mostly dominated by socialists. But also the sub-proletarian Alevi population throughout Turkey, in Istanbul, in the east, heavily participates in May Day. So there might be a more complex class picture there. But the May Day was not that heavily populated. I mean, nothing that could compare to this 900,000 people. It was just several thousand. And we will see what will happen in this coming May Day, which will also be very interesting. But I'm not, expecting another popular revolt. But we never know, of course.
I have two questions, and the first is, in one of your early pages there, the title was The Mainstream Interpretation, and I wondered first if that is the mainstream Western media journalism's interpretation or mainstream within Turkey. That's the first question. The second question is, you've talked about the division between the new bourgeoisie and the working classes. Elsewhere in some of these revolts around the Mediterranean, it seems you could see more of a division between urban and rural. And so I'm wondering about the urban-rural division in Turkey.
Mm-hmm. Okay, the first one is easier. Let me tackle that first. So when I said mainstream, I really was referring to Turkey, but this also very easily maps onto New York Times, Economist, etc. New York Times very recently, like a couple of months ago, published a very long essay in the Sunday or something pages, which combined all of these aspects, so which was very good. But in the heyday of the revolt, what the Western media was emphasizing most was the libertarian aspect, so anti-Erdogan especially. So this became really something about Erdogan. And certainly one part of the protest went in that direction too. So there was a lot of emphasis on the personality of Erdogan. But what I'm trying to say is I'm not trying to dismiss that. So that was happening, but the picture was much more complex. So the second question, in regards to North Africa, I really want to differentiate between Tunisia and Egypt. So in Tunisia, there is much more working class participation, not only in the provinces and the rural areas, where it is much more obvious. But even in the heart of Tunis city. So not only the lawyers and the professionals as in Turkey, but also the unionized working class is heavily not only participating in the protest, but leading the protests in Tunisia. And this is exactly what is not happening in Turkey. Now, when it comes to Egypt, there are parallels as well as differences from Turkey. Let me emphasize the parallels. So the heart of Cairo Square protest was very middle class. Occasionally, just like it happened in Istanbul, the sub-proletarian neighborhoods would come in, walk in, and support Cairo or Tahrir Square, and then go back to their neighborhoods. But Cairo remained heavily middle class. The difference from Turkey is that not in the rural areas, but in the provinces, the industrial provinces of Egypt, there were huge working class revolts. Tanta, Mahalla, Port Said mixed really rather than working class, but lots of working class participation. Iskandariya and Suez, the same thing, mixed class revolt, but heavy working class participation. So outside of Cairo, the working class was more present. But then what happened was, ideologically, culturally, politically, unlike in Tunisia, Tahrir or Egyptian revolt as a whole remained under the influence of the new middle classes. So when it comes to Turkey, the rural areas, well, we should really differentiate. Not much was happening in the actual countryside, but things were happening in the provinces, but only provinces in the west. So along the coastal line. So not in the heartland, which is heavily Sunni Turkish, and not in the east, which is mixed Alevi and Sunni, but heavily Kurdish. So only the Alevi provinces participated in the revolt, and that only in the heyday of the revolt. So Tunceli, for example, which is like almost 99% Kurdish Alevi, was one of the heaviest participants in this revolt in the first 2 weeks of June. So outside of the major cities like Ankara, Izmir, Istanbul, the participation was more clearly divided along sectarian and ethnic lines. So initially that was blurred in Istanbul, but it was much clearer in the provinces.
Yeah, actually I have a couple of questions as well. So the first one is like, how much was ideologically oriented this position? Because based on as you made an analysis of the failure of the Imperial project, and also later on going back to the national view route of AKP, like trying to go, there was, before the Gezi, there was a ban on alcohol in certain times and all of that stuff. And Taksim and those areas was seen historically as at the center of the old style, like the secularist, anti-Islamist kind of movement. So this was like as an ideology to conquer the, well, how can I say, the castle of the old rivals. How much was that ideology of the secularist, non-secularist Islamists in the events of Gezi? The second question is like, you made a really interesting point of this position of the moving people from the apartments to the new places. Erdogan also kind of called building an area for the protesters, for the new middle class to protest. Instead of Taksim, you can build a million people place that you can go and protest. How much that fits on that theory, the disposition, its accommodation of the disposition?
Okay. So actually, your first question brings me to one of my caveats, but in a second. So, as I was saying, this was, rather than secularist protests, these were either post-secular or non-secular protests. So definitely the government has been emphasizing its Sunni Islamic dimensions more when compared to its first 10 years. But the peak of secularist revolt was really 2007, and it failed. It miserably failed. I mean, it made the government much stronger. So it has been said, for example, that I don't exactly agree with this argument, but it has been said that these protesters in 2013 are the children and grandchildren of the people who revolted in 2007 and failed. So in 2007, the people had the street had a much clearer anti-Islamist position. So we don't want a president with a wife who dons the veil. I mean, that was the core of the protest, really. You know, we don't want to see this guy in Çankaya, which is, you know, sort of an equivalent of the White House. We don't want to see this guy there because his wife is veiled. I'm like, oh. So that was the revolt. And that brought, throughout Turkey, that brought 3 million people to the streets. So it's serious. So that kind of discourse was present in the 2013 revolt, but mostly outside of Taksim. So if we can go back to this, I skipped my caveat, but I'm going to come there. So, but first, this map. So in this heart of the revolt, we saw very little of that, but when it comes to certain neighborhoods of Kadıköy, not even the center of Kadıköy, but certain neighborhoods like Bağdat Caddesi. Bağdat Caddesi became the center of this kind of 2007 discourse in 2013. So, you know, they hopelessly wanted to reiterate that position, but it didn't find much resonance. And around June 3, June 4, this anti-Islamist discourse was mixed in with ultra-nationalist discourse, and it tried to force its way into the heart of the revolt, but it was just fought off. So ideologically, the revolt, the leaders of the revolt, the voice of the revolt, resisted this temptation to be identified with secularism as such. But definitely, most of these people were not practicing Muslims, with the exception of several Muslim groups. Quasi-socialist Muslim groups also participated in this revolt. But in terms of, you know, population, maybe there were 5 or 6 groups. Not any one of them can argue that they have more than 500 members. So these are really, really small. Some of them like maybe 50 to 100 members. But so what I'm trying to say is, you know, these people were not practicing Muslims, but this doesn't make it a secularist revolt. And the other thing is very interesting. So I'm emphasizing all of these, you know, quasi-hedonistic tendencies in the revolt, these tendencies of distinction. But then there were these self-limiting tendencies as well. So I'm not trying to sound negative about this revolt. Okay. For example, what did these people do? So they drank beer every night in the heart of Taksim while revolting. So it was not just in the bars. I mean, like, there were these vendors who walked into Taksim and sold cold beer. And Taksim is hot. It's really hot. Beer is nice in that heat. So on Mevlid night, so the birth of the Prophet, when it's being celebrated, these people knew that the revolutionary Muslims, these anti-capitalist Muslims, were there. And just out of respect for them, they did not drink. And this was celebrated, you know, in the non-AKP Muslim circles. Yeah, you know, our victory, but also, yeah, good for them too. So things can change, you know, that potential is there, even though I wouldn't take this as the predominant tendency of the revolt. This self-limiting, reflexive, potential disposition to take the other seriously and build potentially cross-class bridges. It's there, but very restricted.
There were a few Friday prayers too. Weren't that 1 or 2, I remember?
Yes, Friday prayers, and then these huge iftar dinners, so fast-breaking dinners in Ramadan, organized by these anti-capitalist groups. And then, even though, you know, they were not fasting, many of these secular or post-secular people participated in these fast-breaking dinners just again to express solidarity with the practicing Muslims who participated. But, I mean, my whole point is that this is not going to get institutionalized. You know, that's my whole point about Deleuze and Guattari type revolt. So, very good when it's happening, but it doesn't leave anything to 2 weeks after the revolt. Here and then here.
Yeah, you already started talking about that, an aspect that I find very interesting is the demobilization of these revolts, not only in Turkey, but Brazil and Spain and so on. And so, would you say, is there a chance in the short, at least medium term, to keep such a revolt alive and in a form that it could actually challenge the AKP, meaning that it would go beyond a middle class plus a few working class people? Is it, and I'm not talking about like some abstract theoretical ideas of how they can work together, but in the concrete case of Turkey, do you think that in the next 5 to 10 or 15 years, it is actually feasible and possible to create a more inclusive movement that actually has a stronger impact? Do you think that these distinctions are so entrenched that not much will come out of it?
Yeah, my hunch would be the second. So I take the AKP very seriously. I take its success very seriously. I think they have succeeded, and it's not just its own success, but the success of, well-meaning but like counterproductive success of liberal intellectuals who have supported the AKP, the decades of neoliberalization. I find all of these very, very successful. So I don't see much happening in the next 10 years or so. I think they're going to hold on to their power, but I would be so happy to be surprised and proven wrong. But I think, this is a successful political, social, and religious project. That would be my hunch. So what can happen? I mean, they can completely lose their minds and wage war on all the neighbors, and that could result in some anti-war mobilization across class lines. That's and that would be a disaster, right? So I don't necessarily want that to happen, but they might do that. So Erdogan might do that, and the people around him too. Yeah.
I actually had a question about Iran, and it relates, I think, to your presentation. But in your bio, Baki mentioned that you were doing a comparative analysis of Islamic neoliberalism. And was it right that he said the failure of Islamic neoliberalism in Iran? So I wanted you to talk about that a little bit, because that's not... neoliberalism is increasingly becoming a successful project in Iran as we speak. So I was interested to hear what your thoughts on that were. And then also, as it relates to the AKP's Imperial failure, post-2011, what the relationship of Iran and then what's happening in Syria is to that, because Syria is also sort of a post-2011, mostly post-2011 phenomenon, and then all the powers that are now inside Syria, Russia.
Wow, too many questions.
You can just,
I can't answer all of them, but let me try to answer some of them at least. I mean, it really depends on how we define neoliberalism, right? I mean, we can define China as neoliberal. I would not contest that China is on a capitalist path, but unlike Aiwa Ong and many others, I don't see much neoliberalism as such there, okay? And I would say the same with Iran. I think there are many neoliberalizing techniques that are being deployed in Iran, just to use, Aiwa Ong's and similar people's language. But that doesn't really add up to neoliberal Islam. That would be my position. So what I see as neoliberal Islam is the Khatami project, or Rafsanjani Khatami project. So I do not see Ahmadinejad and similar people and their justice shares. So even that kind of privatization, I don't see that exactly as neoliberal Islam. Why? Because privatization by itself does not constitute neoliberalism. So what makes Turkey a neoliberal success is that it is the privatization is wedded to financialization, that is wedded to deregulation, etc., etc. So that there's a whole package of neoliberal ideas that are being implemented on the ground. But actually, let me come through with a stronger caveat about Turkey's neoliberal success. Now, I have more and more doubts about how much neoliberalism can sustain itself as neoliberal in Turkey. Because, I mean, if they go on this path, they might push privatization in a much more sectarian direction, which could hurt overall deregulation. Okay, and this is, you know, so what I'm trying to say is it could become more and more similar to Ahmadinejad's privatization, which is pro-regime privatization. So it's going to people who are going to stay on the side of the regime. So it's very politically and religiously motivated, and it's not geared towards capital accumulation and market peace. So if it's a part of another ideological project, I don't see neoliberalizing techniques as necessarily neoliberal. So again, Turkey might move in this direction in the coming decade. So this is another way in which the government can sabotage itself. I mean, if it moves away from market peace, and if it combines neoliberalizing techniques too strongly with militaristic, imperialistic, and sectarian techniques, then I think that might derail the whole thing and again give rise to more clashes, which would push off, foreign capital, and then there could be a domino effect, and neoliberal peace could no longer be sustained. So that's my point about Iran too. I mean, the privatization by itself does not bring in all of the other goodies of neoliberalism. So it's a very thin neoliberalization. So I wouldn't say there's no neoliberalization in Iran. I think there is, but it doesn't add up to neoliberal Islam. Your second question, I will hold off on that just to take more questions. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I guess I'm sort of interested in just this notion of the problematicness of middle class revolt or sort of middle class uprising, and you mentioned, the comparison also to Occupy in your talk, but also I remember that in one of your pieces from the summer, in Berkeley, I think like you mentioned, also some of the differences between the sort of purely kind of more, I guess both like the more anarchic spirit of Occupy and also just kind of the class position or what like middle class means and who participated in the US as more of like a precariat almost as opposed to in Turkey. And then also you had mentioned that there were sort of a set in terms of organization. In the Gezi protest, there was more of a goal of having like the set list of goals or demands. So I guess I'm curious if it's sort of more. Sorry, this may be like a sort of badly thought out question, but if it's more just the class kind of, so even with all those differences, though, I guess you're suggesting that both kind of dissolved or both kind of, I mean, in different settings. But I just wonder, I just find this notion of the sort of middle class revolt and the sort of the pleasure in conversation, things like this, is kind of an interesting phenomenon. So I guess just
thank you very much for that question. So I'm basically arguing against myself, right? So in that initial piece in Jadiliya, which was written in the first days of the revolt, I think I was carried away a little and overemphasized the differences between Occupy and Gezi. I now looking back on it, I think there are more similarities. But again, there are serious differences. And what are the serious differences? Well, an entrenched socialist culture, mostly like Marxist-Leninist socialist culture, really, in Turkey, which allowed that control on the spirit of the movement or the revolt in the initial 2 weeks. So anarchism, autonomism, these are strong in the academy in Turkey among PhD students. But unlike in the US, you can't say much beyond that. I mean, there is no Auckland in Turkey. I mean, the white culture, not the black Auckland, the white anarchist culture in Auckland, that has no counterpart in Turkey. So the only autonomists and anarchists are concentrated in chic places, really. So yeah, there is that difference, but still the revolt is situated within this global moment where the industrial proletariat is receding, and that really creates a different landscape. So there are these organizational differences between the US and Turkey, historical, political, cultural differences. But overall class map, the declining significance of the proletariat, I think hits both countries, and gives rise to the same kind of dispositions. Again talking in this Bourdieusian language, the same kind of dispositions are out there, and perhaps these ultra energetic activists in Turkey are overtaxing themselves to fight against these tendencies, but they can do so much. So the people who populate the square, who make it 900,000 people, they disappear, and they are actually very disturbed by the Marxism-Leninism. I mean, they would be much more at home with the whites in Auckland, the white anarchists in Auckland. I mean, they would be much more along the same wavelength with them, despite the linguistic differences. So the Marxist-Leninists are like aliens to them, right? So what happens is after July, after mid-July, most of these people disappeared and never came back. So there was this question about the decline of the revolt overall. This has to do with that too. So between mid-June and mid-July, there were still these assemblies where these anarchistic professionals, not anarchists though, just anarchistic professionals, participated heavily in the assemblies in Beşiktaş and Kadıköy, these two middle-class districts. But after the summer, it was just the Alevis and a bunch of Alevi neighborhoods, not Alevis throughout Turkey, just a bunch of Alevi neighborhoods and the socialists and the professional associations under their control and the campuses under their control that remained up in arms. But these chic professionals, gone after mid-July, never to return back. Except in a funeral, but yeah, I won't go into too much detail. One last question, perhaps, or should we go on? Yeah, or two. Yeah, go ahead.
Please.
Yeah.
There was a lot of material that you presented here today, and I happened to be in Turkey at that time also, and I was in Ankara, not in Istanbul, but there are certain expressions that that you use which a little bit disturb me, and I like you to at least explain one of them. Western press has talked many times about secularist and cultural elite, which happened to be myself, really.
Yeah, me too.
We all are, really. And
I wouldn't call myself a secularist, but definitely.
In a way, the way those terms are used are is denigrating to any one of us who was born and raised and educated in Turkey, as if we are a special type of a people that that have ignored the rest of the society for some reason. But but you used a term, maybe continue to keep using this, which a little bit disturbs me, is that the word revolt. I would like you to explain the context of that word and exactly what you mean by that, because the Turkish equivalent of that word, isyan, in a way, they don't match at all, and revolt is like a little too strong of a word for me, and that's I'd like you to talk about that little bit if you can. And the other thing is that again, I'm a little bit disturbed, and I'd like to ask you about it, and you could probably make a little bit comment, is that you have minimized the or you're attempting to minimize a little bit your own cultural upbringing and mind, and by saying that those people in you know, not in Taksim, but you know, a very expensive shopping area, that they are, you know, first of all, they're not wealthy people. A lot of my relatives work, and then they go have lunches at shopping centers, like a lot of people do here. You know, we wouldn't call those people as, you know, just because they socialize there, they're any different than teenagers that socialize in shopping centers here in this country. You know, so I don't know why you know, your attitude toward those people is little. You know, well, not little, really. You talk quite a bit about it, and they, you know, you talked about people drinking beer. You know, I mean, people still have to eat and they still have to drink. You know, it's nothing. It's nothing. It doesn't take anything away from them just because, you know, they went to have dinner and came back to a demonstration, which I like to use as a word a little more possibly accurate than word revolt. I'll stop there because that's quite a bit. So.
Well, there are too many questions there. I can't answer all of them. But very quick sentence on revolt versus demonstration. Then I want to talk about more about the cultural elite or new middle classes. So yeah, revolt rather than demonstration, because when I say that, yeah, these are demonstrations, protests too. But when 900,000 people come out onto the streets and occupy a square and fight the police, I mean, this is more than a demonstration. And I'm not using revolt in a denigrating way, but actually in a positive way. But it doesn't always have to be positive. So, you know, there can be revolts of ethnic cleansing too, but I see this as a positive anti-authoritarian, anti-neoliberal revolt. And in the case of Hatay, it's also anti-imperial. So I don't see why that's a negative term. It's not for me. But so more comments on the cultural elite, or cultural elite. I'm fine with that term too, but I really prefer the new middle classes or the new petit bourgeoisie. And let me tell you what I mean by them. I explained it a little bit. So I'm not saying that these are wealthy people. That's why what I specified actually. They are below the upper classes. They are dominated by the upper classes. They are dominated by these projects of neoliberalization. But they are dominant over, and they have control over the working classes, and they are far more dominant over far more distinct than the subproletariat. So these class fractions, and this is a sociological fact. You know, there's nothing we can gain by denying this. They have stakes in the status quo. They have stakes in keeping themselves distinct. But they also have stakes in challenging the upper classes. And that's why they have contradictory dispositions. And this is what most of the critical scholarship on the new middle classes is about. You know, they have these anti-status quo reflexes, but they have also very strong pro-status quo reflexes. And now I don't see how being aware of this really hurts us, because it really shows us the limits of this revolt. And yeah, people have to eat and drink, but this is not just true. I mean, the distinction that comes with eating and drinking, it's not just true about revolt time. Any kind of eating at a restaurant or even at home places you somewhere in the class map, and it reproduces your place in the class map. It's not just about the revolt. But what I'm trying to say is this is reproduced even within revolt, or you know, if you want to call it that, demonstrations or protests. So protests and demonstrations are not that different from everyday life in this regard. The class distinctions are reproduced. And this is what is keeping a lot of people out of these protests. And this is what is further integrating the working classes into this regime in Turkey. And without understanding any of this, we can't really fight that integration. I mean, if we insist on ignoring why, you know, these quote-unquote ignorant people are buying into this regime, we can't really fight the regime.
Okay, well, thank you for this presentation. It was really good, and I learned a
For the elite participating in this kind of big movement and then disappearing, I can totally see this is happening in Turkey all the time because there is just such apathy that I was one of them too, so I left Turkey 30 years ago, but we just talk amongst ourselves and we say, when we talk, we think we're a big group of us, and then we sort of forget that there's a big part of Turkey that is not participating in this conversation, and then there should be a unifying purpose or cause to make a bigger impact and sustainable impact, kind of, to keep it going. There was this question previously. So, yeah, I mean, they like to intellectualize, but it doesn't seem to generate big wave and stay. So I don't know how that can happen, but it seems to be historically true.
Yeah.
All the time.
Yeah, I agree. Well, the government has to make more mistakes.
Yeah.
I was going to ask what you thought of the Gülen movement's impact in the last elections, because I was also expecting that AKP would win, but I don't think they won as many votes as they did in the last general elections. Compared to the last general elections, they lost some votes, and I imagine that was the impact of the various corruption scandals, the tapes and everything that were shared, which looked as if the Gülen movement was after those sharing. So Gülen movement, clearly, whatever alliance they had is now sort of being renegotiated or is broken. And I'm wondering whether there could be some maybe damage to the success story of AKP in the coming years from there, because Gülen movement is also conservative, is also neoliberal. I can't quite see ideologically their differences. It seems more of a sharing power issue. One has a cadre that wants to be employed in certain offices, and the other one now says no to it, and so there is a clash. But in terms of ideology, they're both the same. Muslim culture, to me it looks like, I don't know. So how do you interpret what Gülen movement did in the last elections and their possible long-term impact?
There's too much here, but if I could answer some of it. Yeah, I mean, they have their similarities, but they have stark differences as well. So the Gülen community was neoliberal or pro-regime, pro-US throughout its history, or at least after the 1980s when Turkey started to get neoliberal. The AKP or the people around Erdogan came to that line only after 1997. So in the closing of the 20th century. So essentially what happened was the AKP approached the Gülen line rather than being always on the same page with them. And after the Arab protests, which I never came to cover, the base and the activists and the intellectuals of the AKP started to question that convergence. Not just with Gülen, but with the US and with the Turkish state and with neoliberal policies in general. So that also led to some frictions between them, especially the issue of Israel. After the Arab Revolt, after the Mavi Marmara incident, the AKP activists started to think that Gülen was just tying their hands. Otherwise, they were just going to fight Israel and do away with Israel. I mean, this is an exaggeration, but there are some who seriously think so. That Erdogan can undermine Israel. So there are some serious differences, and these are increasing, the ideological differences. But of course, there is this power sharing issue as well. The power sharing issue existed throughout the 2000s. It was kept under the covers. So within each specific institution, there were a lot of fights, but this wasn't being reflected in the media and in the mainstream. So these really combined. These were really combined after 2011. So the growing ideological rift and the power sharing battles. So what's going to happen to AKP after this? I think losing Gülen is problematic, not in terms of the votes it will cost, because unlike most people, I don't think Gülen can mobilize a lot of votes. But it's going to cost them in terms of ties with the world markets, with the world business class, financial circles throughout the world, and the entrenched bureaucracy in Turkey. So Gülen was kind of a bridge. You know, it was the community was making them more acceptable to the financial elites throughout the world, to the business elites, old business elite in Turkey, to the old bureaucratic elites in Turkey. And now with that bridge gone, now I think the party is in a tougher situation in terms of selling itself as acceptable, you know, as good, nice neoliberal kids.
I'm gonna try to make it short. You emphasize, like, for the limitation of the movement, the class stratification, right? But how about, like, the limitation of their agenda, like their expectation, because different groups taking part of in the movement, but their expectation and their agenda and is very different, and they maybe, I would say, they couldn't create like the united agenda to sustain the movement, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I wonder what you think about it.
Yes, I mean, this is an issue, but given the extremely fractional nature of oppositional politics in Turkey, just take the socialist left. There were 80 fractions when I was following and trying to count them in the 1990s. I'm sure there are twice as many today. That's just the socialist left. But beyond that, there are many other ideological divisions. So despite that, I found it quite remarkable that they could have unified demands and some unified language. So Taksim Solidarity, the overall platform that guided the revolt, not only pushed for these four specific demands, but they also produced documents which sort of summarized the goals of the movement. I found that very impressive, because in the 1990s that couldn't have happened. I mean, people were taking, let's say, the Maoists, just the Maoists. There are 10, 15 different kinds of Maoists in Turkey. They were taking their different interpretations of Mao too seriously to, agree on a single sentence. And these different fractions, and not just the socialists, but social democrats, Kemalists, LGBT, the soccer fans, all of these could sit down and produce these documents for several months. I found that extremely impressive. So I wouldn't say that was the main stumbling block for the movement. So this is an issue. I mean, I'm not trying to discount that this is an issue. So even if we had no class issue, this would become an issue. But what I'm trying to say is really the new structure of capitalism, the new class map, the new stratification in Turkey, in the US, in Egypt, is creating bigger problems than the factionalism.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much again.
Thank you for your patience. I'm going to stop this. I'll go up, have to leave these, and then we'll come back. So there are a few more moments here.